Yes, item B9 is to receive a presentation from Dr. Kristina Hill, Associate Professor of Environmental Planning and Urban Design and Director of the Institution of Urban and Regional Development at UC Berkeley, to further our understanding of the latest science regarding sea level rise and its impact on our city.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, I can frame the item if you like.
Please.
Okay, so as mentioned by our city clerk, Dr. Kristina Hill is a professor of environmental planning and urban design and director of the Institute of Urban and Regional Development at UC Berkeley. Her background is in geology, landscape planning, and ecology. And her PhD dissertation was on how to handle uncertainties in mapping, which serves her well and serves us well in the study of sea level rise. She studies changes in environmental conditions as a result of urbanization and climate change, and develops urban design approaches, infrastructure strategies, and habitat conservation strategies. Now in Richmond, as we all know, we have 32 miles of shoreline, and it's essential we look ahead as the scientific data examines the acceleration of sea level rise. And just as a reminder to those of us that were here back on April 20th of 2021, myself and Mayor Martinez, who was then a council member, brought an item to the city council, which was a presentation from Dr. Hill. So this will be our second opportunity to hear from her. We also, in April of 2021, unanimously passed a resolution which resolved that all new scientific information will be verified and incorporated into our climate action plan. So I will be turning this over in a second to Dr. Hill. But I do want to state that this presentation will further our understanding of the challenges that are to come in regard to sea level rise and its impact on our shoreline, on our city, on our community. And it's so important for us to think ahead, because we need to start building a sustainable and healthy future. And, you know, this kind of information is critical to that. And the final thing I want to say before we get Dr. Hill to begin her presentation is, and this is a request of you, Mr. Mayor, some community members have asked if after we hear from Dr. Hill that we can go directly to the public speakers, because they have some comments that they want to share with us as well, and then bring it back to the council for discussion and questions. So would that be okay to first hear the presentation, then the public comments, then the council discussion?
I'm good with that.
Oh, good. Okay. So with that, Dr. Hill, thank you for being here, and look forward to your sharing your information with us.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember McLaughlin and Mayor Martinez, for having me. I appreciate the invitation. I know you're all busy, so I'll keep this as brief as I can and try to be to the point about what's changing and what might be particularly important for the city of Richmond. Are those slides showing up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what the state has been recommending for guidance about how communities can plan for sea level rise. One of the important things that we've learned in our state from looking around the world is that the Dutch have been planning for sea level rise since 2009. This was an illustration from Rotterdam's Water Plan 2.0 in 2009. So they must have started sometime around 2000 in this process. So they're planning for a combination of sources of flooding. And I'll start with sea level rise, but I'll come back to groundwater, which is the arrow coming up from below. I want to remind everybody that we're already essentially on a new planet, because there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we've never seen this amount of carbon dioxide in the past since human beings have been called human beings. And there's no way to take all of that out. So the consequence of it is going to be that we'll see a rise in sea level, even if we stopped emitting all of the CO2 today. So this is an irreversible impact now. The state in 2018 issued guidance to California communities that suggested that if a community was making a permanent high value investment, they should consider this high red or orange line on this graph and the possibility that sea level could rise to something around 0.5 foot to almost 2 feet by 2040, and up to 2.5 feet by 2050. And that if people were making a low cost temporary investment, it would be okay to use the low range of sea level rise. So that's how the state tried to help people cope with the uncertainty about this in 2018. And we're continuing to learn about what's happening with melting glaciers in Antarctica and in Greenland, which sounds far away, but it's going to have a very strong local impact. And as we look at new research, we're learning from probes that have been dropped below the ice. So this is an image of a camera in a remotely operated submarine vehicle that's dropped through a drilled hole in the ice and then examines the ice below in the ocean to try to understand what's happening to the glaciers. So it's a new tool, and we've gotten new research results in the last couple of years. And this kind of busy slide is from one of my colleagues who's been doing that research. And what they have found is that a very important glacier known as Thwaites Glacier is losing its grip on what they call the seamount. So they expect to see this glacier come loose from its moorings on the rock around 2030. And if that happens, because it's highly fractured and melting quite a bit from below, if that happens, then we're going to see higher rates of sea level rise. So people around the world are watching this particular glacier. It's like the cork in the bottle. If this glacier lets go, a lot of other ice will melt. And it could take a couple hundred years, but we're headed for about 10 feet of sea level rise. If this glacier does let loose. And we should know that within 8 years or less. So the new news about sea level rise is that in the next 30 years, we expect it to rise about 1 foot, which is about as much as it rose in the last 100 years. So it's clearly getting faster. We're going to see 1 foot in 30 years instead of over 100 years. Between 2050 and 2100, we could still see a rise to between 6 and 10 feet. That's still a possibility. And if the Thwaites Glacier is released from its mooring on the rock, then we're more likely to be 6 feet and above. So that's the new news. And there's some good news and some bad news, but the overall picture is that sea level is rising and there's no way to stop it. So the seriousness of this problem becomes really apparent when we look at the maps. So Richmond has a lot of vulnerability to sea level rise. This map shows where the tidal marshes and mudflats were in Richmond before it was developed in its current form. The darker brown areas are tidal marshes and mudflats. And you can see the current location of Point Richmond, the Harbor Channel, and Point Isabel on this map. All of that area that used to be tidal marsh and mudflat is likely to be impacted by sea level rise. This is a map from BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, where they're sharing information that they have about where they think flooding will occur. And as I said, we're now expecting to get to 10 feet of sea level rise eventually. This map shows about 9 feet, and it shows all the areas that would flood when we reach 9 feet of sea level rise. I shouldn't say if, because it's going to happen at some point. This is an area that's particularly vulnerable along the south shoreline. This is known as the Liquid Gold site. It's one of the Superfund sites along the south shoreline of Richmond. That's Hoffman Marsh behind it on the right, and 580 directly behind it on the back, and the Panhandle neighborhood behind that. I wanted to show you on a map what we expect to see happen at that site alone. With 1 foot of sea level rise, there'll be permanent standing water on the area within the boundary of the Superfund site. With 2 feet, there would be more permanent standing water. With 3 feet, the site would probably begin to come apart as waves and tides start to erode it. And what's concerning about that, of course, is that this is contaminated soil. So we're concerned about the impact on the bay, but also if you notice on this map, the blue area extends across the highway into the Panhandle neighborhood. So we're concerned about the impact that exposure and erosion of the marsh with its hazardous chemicals underneath, how they might migrate at high tide into a residential area. That's just the sea level rise component of the problem, and it's clearly serious for that southern part of Richmond. Now, I mentioned that the Dutch have also looked at rising groundwater, and that's what I'd like to talk about briefly next. Groundwater in California is often thought of as a scarce resource because we talk about it in terms of the Central Valley and not having enough for irrigation when we're in a drought phase. But I'm talking about a different kind of groundwater. I'm talking about the very shallowest groundwater that if you dig down at the beach, that's what you find in the sand. It's very shallow. It comes from rain. It actually accumulates in the soil after it rains and is quite high seasonally after a rainstorm. And the freshwater groundwater originates from rain and flows towards the bay. Underneath that is saltwater groundwater. And as the tide rises and falls, that pushes freshwater groundwater up towards the surface. And as the ocean rises with sea level rise, that will push freshwater groundwater up towards the surface. We're talking about groundwater that exists between the soil particles, and the top of that groundwater is called the water table. You may have heard that term used, the water table. It's just the top of that saturated zone in the soil, sometimes right below the surface. And this image from the American Public Works Association just shows a camera image of how groundwater enters sewer pipes and storm sewers, sanitary sewers and storm sewers. And when the water enters those pipes, it can block the function of the pipe. So the pipe can't carry rainwater away because it's already full of water leaking into it from groundwater. So that's a serious impact on infrastructure as groundwater begins to rise. And that can happen within the first few inches of groundwater rise, that we start to see an impact on underground infrastructure. I have this cartoon that kind of shows how those impacts add up. The light blue shows fresh groundwater. The dark blue shows salty groundwater underneath. And you can see the cartoon has a levee and a pipe, a road and a creek bed, and it has a parking lot with contaminated sediment underneath. We've often capped contaminated sediments rather than removing them, which made sense in the 1980s. But doesn't make as much sense anymore because now we know that groundwater is rising. So let me show you what kinds of things are going to happen. First, that groundwater is going to enter underground pipes, and it's going to begin to intersect with the contaminated sediment in the soil with just the first few inches of change. This is a possibility. It'll lead to more creek flows, so higher flows in creeks. It'll eventually create surface flooding and mobilize those contaminants underground. And this is all happening even though a levee is shown in the cartoon. So even if communities around the Bay Edge build levees, the groundwater will rise behind those levees, and we could find ourselves having spent billions of dollars for a shoreline protection system that doesn't actually prevent us from flooding, because groundwater will come up from below and from the sides. And this is already beginning to happen in some places around the Bay Edge. This is on Marina Boulevard in San Leandro, where salt water is mixing with freshwater groundwater and coming up through holes in maintenance covers near the shoreline area. So that's groundwater coming up at high tide. So Richmond also has vulnerability to rising groundwater. This map is shared at the Our Coast, Our Future map viewer, and it shows US Geological Survey's modeling of depth to groundwater around the whole California coast. And in this case, the red, orange, and yellow are concerning because it shows groundwater is already shallow in much of Richmond. And it's between 6 feet and 0 feet of the surface during the wet season. So today, for example, it's been pretty wet over the last few weeks, as we all know, and groundwater probably is very shallow in these areas that are red, orange, or yellow. And it's farther down where it's purple. With 20 inches of sea level rise, we'd see an increase in the area that is orange and yellow. And with a meter of sea level rise, about 40 inches, we would see a further increase. So we're starting to see emergent groundwater and groundwater that is so close to the surface that it's effectively saturating the soil, which will have an impact on underground infrastructure, potentially mobilizing some contaminants that are in the soil, and changing earthquake shaking risks for structures in these areas that have rising groundwater. The other interesting thing, at least to me, I hope to you also, about Richmond's geology is that there are old river channels that came down from the hills. That's what I'm showing here in this kind of pinkish purple color. And those old riverbeds, dating back thousands of years, carry a lot of groundwater more quickly to the shoreline. And these white circles are showing where that faster moving groundwater may actually rise sooner. So all of these areas at the ends of these fingers of the old riverbeds have a slightly elevated risk of high groundwater causing serious problems within the next 30 years. And then contamination of the soil, of course, is a serious health concern for people and for the bay. We've made some new maps that show where the contaminated sites are over groundwater that is going to be rising. And not all of these sites are dangerous that I've marked here in black. Some of them have no contamination left, but all of these black dots should be investigated to confirm that they're not a hazard. So what we're trying to do with this map is show all of the possible sites. And just in the city of Richmond, there are more than 200 possible sites that should be investigated to determine whether, as groundwater rises, there may be risks to human health as well as the bay. I wanted to show you an example of a zone we've been looking at with my graduate students over the last few years. This zone includes the Richmond Field Station, which of course belongs to my institution, UC Berkeley. It shows the AstraZeneca site, it shows the Blair landfill, and it shows the liquid gold site. And these red circles at the beginnings of these pink arrows, these are all monitoring wells where contaminants have been detected recently or in the past. And these pink lines show the flow directions of the contaminants. If they were flowing, this is the direction that they would flow in. Across the Richmond Field site to parcels off of that site, across the Zeneca site and through this light industrial neighborhood to the east, and from the Blair landfill site to Baxter Creek, and from the liquid gold site to Baxter Creek. So we're drawing these lines to try to show how contamination on one site can become an issue for an adjacent site. And one of the primary dynamics that we're concerned about is that if some contaminants called volatile organic compounds get into sewer pipes, the gas component of that contaminant can enter buildings, workplaces, schools, and residences. through cracked seals in older plumbing fixtures like toilets that haven't been updated and would allow gases to come into the house from the sewer. If you look at this part of the map I've circled in white, these black dashed lines are sewer lines. And if the contaminants are flowing from the Zeneca site, then we would see potential risks of contamination in the sewer lines that could spread to all these buildings here marked in white that are uphill of the points where the contaminants flow across the sewer lines. So that's the kind of thing we're concerned about throughout Richmond, not just in the South Shoreline area, that as groundwater rises and contaminants begin to flow, we may see new sources of human health risks. So we know in conclusion that Richmond faces some significant risks to health, the environment, buildings and infrastructure as a result of rising sea level and rising groundwater. And that adds up to a risk to the property tax base for coastal cities, not just Richmond, but many cities around the Bay, and potentially to a city's bond rating if no adaptation plans are made. The risk there is that if your bond rating goes down, you have to borrow at a higher rate, higher interest rate, and might have a lower cap to potential borrowing. So capacity for adaptation can actually go down at the time when a community needs to be able to borrow to adapt. The other big issue for thinking about the fiscal component of this is that if the debt repayment period for an investment in roads or buildings or parks, if the debt repayment period exceeds the useful life of that asset, then that's money essentially down the drain because it won't be available to pay for new adaptation measures. So it's very, very important for decision makers like a city council or city manager to consider the debt repayment period in relation to the useful life of an asset as sea level rises. And then I wanted to end on a little bit of a hopeful note. There are cities that have succeeded for hundreds of years in high groundwater zones, like the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where canals basically function to draw groundwater out of the surrounding blocks and allow people to live for longer in an area where groundwater is rising. But it's a different way of doing development. It requires some change in thinking. And the new idea for the Dutch, this is their 600-year-old idea, their new idea is to build floating structures attached to piers that allow people, this is actually an affordable housing development in Amsterdam called Steiger Island, and it allows people to live in a zone where the water is very high and live with appropriate structures for things like earthquakes, as well as for flooding. And the motto the Dutch are using is that they want to live with higher water, not try to block it all out. And that's a reasonable motto for the whole Bay Area to think about. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say, I think there are ways to protect the safety of people in Richmond, support a high quality of life, and conserve the value of public and private assets. But that has to begin with smart investments in relation to areas we know are vulnerable. We need to invest in places that are less vulnerable, and then make an adaptation plan, identify pathways that allow us to make multiple steps over time. This is going to require multiple phases of adaptation to get to 9 or 10 feet of sea level rise over what might be 80 years and might be a couple hundred years. And then to prepare at contaminated sites by excavating or treating soils before they get wet, and investigating all of those 200 plus sites to identify which ones might present the greatest risks to people in Richmond. And with that, I'll close. Thank you again for inviting me to speak.
Thank you. So do we have any questions? Yes, Vice Mayor McLaughlin.
Mr. Mayor, you had said you agreed to let the public speak first because they have some comments that will help,
Yes, thank you.
our discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so then let's open the public comment.
Okay, we currently have 3 hands raised. The first hand is Mark Wasberg. Jesse Turan, Paul Carmen, and the list is growing, Stuart Flashman, Jamin Purcell, and Tarnell Abbott. Mark Wasberg, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this sounds like a horror movie. I mean, she's more worried about the groundwater coming up from the ground than the ocean's going to swallow up Richmond and San Francisco in about a couple hundred years. I mean, this is hard. This is hard to believe. You know, I mean, who really cares what's going to happen in a couple hundred years? Because we won't be around here anyway. You know, when she started talking about the money, all it is a scam to raise the taxes. That's what they're going to do. They're going to start raising your taxes, your property tax. Eventually, Chevron's going to move out because the taxes be so high. It's a con game. That's all it is. I mean, face it. You people are going to have to realize this is what governments do. I like to know how much money they paid this Dr. Doomsday for coming on the city council, coming on here and scaring the people half to death and say, well, you're going to be underwater in another 80 years. Like I say, who cares? Eat and drink, tomorrow we die. All right. So like I say, you're really going to have to look at this stuff. I think this is a big con game by the RPA just to hire, just to get your more taxes and to scare you people and all this global warming stuff. All right. Sure. Richmond and San Francisco will probably be underwater another couple of hundred years, but hell, we ain't going to be around. So like I say, enjoy it while you can. But don't let the city council sit in their BS you try to make this some type of horror thing that your house is going to be underwater and everybody's going to drown. Then you got to move up to higher ground and it won't be no room there. So everybody's just going to start drowning. I yield my time. This is a bunch of crap.
And the next speaker is Jesse Turan. Jesse, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Thank you. My name is Jesse Turan. I'm a Richmond resident. And I know that with regard to the groundwater and to soil detoxification, that there are agricultural means of ameliorating the future problems. Such sunflowers have been used in the land around Chernobyl to rid the soil of radioactive waste. There's also certain algae. And I'm wondering if there could possibly be some test research projects, such as at the Berkeley field station, to use those agricultural means to get rid of these toxins in the soil. And then if they seem to be doing the job, if those could be extended to other places around Richmond as well. I'm sure that there are other means of detoxification too. It's just I'm more familiar with the sunflowers, algae, and mushrooms, I believe was the third. And I believe charcoal as well. So I was wondering if the doctor knew anything about that and what she would recommend as far as that goes, and if she might have contacts at UC Berkeley who are more involved with researching those things, because I know soil depletion and soil toxicity are both big issues, especially to Richmond. Also, I'm wondering why AstraZeneca has never been held accountable for poisoning our land. Because it seems to me like they should foot the bill for a lot of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Paul Carmen. Paul, please unmute yourself, then you may begin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to thank Dr. Hill for a wonderful presentation. And I especially want to thank her for her contributions to giving the Department of Toxic Substance Control. She's given them pause to the development at AstraZeneca She's played a major role in that, and it's a sensible thing to do to get that site cleaned up completely before housing's built there. But I think the main moral of the story here is that the city's planning department, there's all sorts of housing projects along the shoreline. There's 5 or 6 of them that can't get off the ground, and most of them are related to sea level rise. And it's time for the city to focus their housing to meet the housing element numbers, to focus on infill sites and inner city housing projects, and stop focusing all their energy on the shoreline for housing. I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Stuart Flashman. Stuart, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Good evening, Stuart Flashman, and I'm an attorney. I've been representing a number of community groups on the AstraZeneca site in terms of trying to ensure that that site gets fully cleaned up before anything else is done with it. And I would urge the city to take another look at the development agreement that the prior council committed the city to, which does have an escape clause for threats to human health and safety. And frankly, the combination of sea level rise and groundwater rise on that site, the AstraZeneca site, is in fact a major threat to health and safety, not only at that site where the developer wants to put up to 4,000 units of housing, but on the adjoining sites, because what's going to happen as the sea level and groundwater rise, because they're planning to cap that site with a pretty much impermeable concrete cap. And when you block anything from moving up with the groundwater and seawater moving up from the ground, it's going to move to the side. And that means that the toxics that are on that site right now, and particularly the volatile organic compounds, are going to move to the adjacent properties, which means that those properties are going to be contaminated, and the bay is going to be contaminated, and the marsh is going to be contaminated. So it doesn't make any sense to be moving forward as DTSC has proposed and as the developer wants to do. We need to get out of that development agreement and start looking at something that would give us a full cleanup of the site, rather than the risky proposal that DTSC has committed itself to. Thank you. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. The next speaker is Tarnell Abbott. Tarnell, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hi, Tarnell Abbott, Richmond resident. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for a great presentation. There's so much to cover and so little time, but yes, let's think about 7 generations forward who will be here, or even my own grandchildren who will be here, and then hopefully within the next 50 or 60 years anyway. So the Zeneca site is not the only one. It's a major one. It's the most complicated one. It's one of the worst, or the worst, in the state of California. It cannot be cleaned up using the biological control methods that have been thrown out now and again. It's got more than 100 different chemicals of concern or toxic chemicals that are intermixed. So nobody actually even really knows what will be the result of the mixture of all of those different chemicals. Arsenic, lead, PCBs, everything on the A to Z list that you want to think about that's on the banned list, or the worst of the worst, is in there. And there's 500,000 cubic yards of it. And yes, AstraZeneca should be held accountable for cleaning it up. They are the responsible party. They have done their best legal maneuvering to avoid having to clean it up, which includes it's the reason it is not currently on a Superfund list is because they agreed to do a voluntary cleanup, and the voluntary cleanup that is being proposed is inadequate. And the city really is going to have to take the DTSC to task to follow through with their new guidelines about sites, hazardous waste sites that are on areas that will be.
Your time has expired. The next speaker is Visa K, followed by Jamin Purcell, Tony Sustak, and Alfredo Angelo. Lisa, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hello, I'm Vesico Malainen. I am a lifelong Richmond resident. I just kind of want to offer a rebuttal to, I believe it's Professor Hill. I want to alleviate some of this alarmist theory where glaciers are melting. There's a difference between glaciers and floating ice. That's why we call it the Arctic Sea. And the Antarctica is on land. You can melt Arctic Sea. It will not raise the sea level. Put an ice cube in a glass of water, it won't spill over. So, and even now, as we speak, the Sierra and many others are adding to the glacier pack, which is actually depreciating the sea level. And so here we go with this natural cycle. I saw your graphics. We go from 3 feet to 10 feet. And I'm more on the line. I agree with some increase, but I'm more on the line with inches. So let's not go spend $1 billion for something that might just be inches. So that's what I got to say. You got anything to say back to me, feel free to please do. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jamin Purcell. Jamin, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hello. First, I would like to thank Dr. Hill, and I would like to thank Vice Mayor McLaughlin for making sure that we had this presentation. Having come from Alaska, I have seen glaciers that were there in my childhood that are no longer present, and we are already losing some of the permafrost, which is releasing more held gases that are being released into the atmosphere, and further increasing the threat that we are facing. But here in Richmond, this is why this is so important, is because where we often build our housing for low income and for people of color is on these toxic waste sites. They do inadequate cleanups. They do slapdash jobs. A similar situation to what they were trying to do at AstraZeneca happened in New Orleans with the Gordon Plaza, where a number of families were found to have been exposed to toxic chemicals that they were not informed of. And we have a number of communities that are actually right adjacent to these toxic waste sites. Crescent Park is one of them. We don't have adequate knowledge about what is in these what is in the soil because we don't do soil testing. And with Chevron, we as well have had multiple different times where it's released, where it does releases, and we don't know what the contamination, how far it goes away from these individual sites. And as we are continuing to have sea levels rise, these chemicals and these the VOCs and such are going to continue to disseminate into our soil. And simple things like putting coals and stuff like that to neutralize the acidity is just not enough. We need to know what's in the soil. Please push for testing.
Your time has expired. Thank you. The next speaker is Tony Sestak. Tony, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Yeah, good evening, Mayor, City Council. Dr. Hill, I can absolutely assure you that your check is in the mail. I have to give the corporate interests who have worked so assiduously at confusing the issues around climate change, catastrophic climate change, sea level rise, so that even people who are really kind of smart have gotten really confused about these issues, have been misled. So, for example, the gentleman who spoke before me, yeah, the Antarctic ice is on a landmass. When that ice melts, unlike the ice cube, which is already in the water, that ice is then going to become water added to the ocean. It isn't going to be static in a way like the ice at the North Pole, which is already floating on the water. Again, I think one takeaway for those of us in Richmond who will really be unable to confront the corporate titans who are pushing this misinformation is to add a piece in the city charter to the code that says, if you build on the shoreline, the future taxpayers of the city of Richmond and the future city councils will have no responsibility for any losses you incur if what people are predicting here is true. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Alfredo Angulo. Please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hello, Mayor Martinez, members of the City Council, and Dr. Hill. My name is Alfredo Angulo. I am a member of the Richmond community and an organizer with the Crescent Park Healthy Environment Project. I would first like to thank you, Dr. Hill, for sharing your expertise with us and all the research that you lead at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. This presentation was very enlightening. We know here in Richmond we know that Richmond, like all coastal cities, is going to be affected by sea level rise in very dangerous ways, like you spoke to. And I think one of the really important things that we need to add to this matrix is the fact that Richmond has a deep history of chemical manufacturing and industrial pollution. And what that means is, as Dr. Hill spoke to, is that a lot of our already vulnerable community members are at risk of being exposed to these toxic chemicals that historically we've just tried to cap and get rid of or outright ignore. And with these more common storms, it's more common in areas around Baxter Creek that these drains will back up and overflow, and if the toxic groundwater is mixing into Baxter Creek, what that means is that, again, during these storms, that pollution is going to find its way into our backyards and closer to our homes. Chemicals that we know zero amount of exposure is safe for humans, regardless of whether or not you live close to the shoreline, regardless of whether or not you live close to these sites. And I would really ask the city council to prioritize the community's health and consider putting an end to housing developments along the shoreline, particularly developments on top of toxic waste sites, like the proposed development on the Zeneca toxic waste site. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that was our last speaker.
Thank you. Okay, now it is, I close public hearing and it's time for questions and answers. Comments from the council. I see that Councilmember Bana has her hand up. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Very interesting information. I have many questions. Just one important one about the old riverbeds. I didn't get the significance of those, and also where they end. Is it the issue of elevation? Oh, what's significant about them?
So the groundwater coming down from the hills can move really easily in the sorted gravels of those old riverbeds. So it's almost like a pipe carrying water faster and in greater quantity to the shoreline. And when it comes to the fill, it backs up because the fill isn't as permeable. So we should see higher groundwater at the end of those old riverbeds than we would see immediately adjacent to them.
So it's actually their level with respect to they're at the lower level, like a natural pipe already.
Yeah, they're like a natural pipe carrying
Okay.
more groundwater to the end of them. And then it gets backed up when it hits the fill.
Thank you.
Councilmember Robinson.
As brief as possible. Just thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's really important information to share with the city, with everyone, with city council members, because we have to make, kind of decisions about developments that are going to be impacted by, what's happening with climate and what's happening with sea level rise. And then just for people who live here, so they can begin to hear these things and process the changes that are coming. I wanted to say, I wondered if you knew about any other changes besides the changes that DTSC announced recently to their rules, having to do with building code or development that would take into consideration some of the things that you're bringing to light around, you know, building along the shoreline, as well as building best practices on building on contaminated sites. Like, for instance, you said, you know, what we have been doing is capping and thinking all is well, but this really changes that. And I wonder if you know of kind of changes to rules, agency rules around that.
The only other regulatory change that I'm aware of is that the San Francisco Bay Area Water Board has now required companies and cities that manage landfills in the coastal zone to look at how rising groundwater might affect landfills. But I think we're still waiting to see how building code might be affected. There is a serious risk that salinity in groundwater could cause foundations to corrode faster. And that's something that's come up in discussions of the Surfside condominium collapse that happened near Miami. So we're concerned that the lifetime of infrastructure and building foundations is going to be shorter in a more saline environment. And Oakland Airport, actually the whole port of Oakland, is doing a study now of how that might occur. So hopefully we'll all learn from the study that that the port's going to conduct.
Thank you. Just one other comment, and that is, you know, I think it's a really important educational activity for everyone who lives in Richmond to take a trip to the EPA site to look at the ground, to look at the brownfield and Superfund sites that exist in Richmond, so people understand how many sites that we have, and that's not even just contaminated sites, but those are the, you know, kind of Superfund and designated brownfield sites, and how many possibilities for this kind of impact there are, you know, and I would really love to work with our city manager and everything to have a better understanding of those sites and a better plan on how to deal with them. Besides, you know, and then just to understand better their current status. I say that because, you know, I just had a meeting with DTSC last week to talk about just what you were talking about, which is the possibility of a contaminated site, you know, moving that contamination across the city pretty far, possibly through broken sewer lines, to contaminate other sites downstream along the Baxter Creek, you know, kind of corridor. And then having the possibility of those contaminants coming up through the OCs into people's homes. And you know, that's alarming. It's shocking. I wonder how much we don't know, and how much is happening already, if that's already happening and it's been known for over a decade. So just leave that comment there, because I know we have a lot on the agenda. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Vice Mayor McLaughlin.
Yes, I just want to thank Dr. Hill for another wonderful presentation that gives us so much to contemplate and think about and plan for. I do want to say the district that I represent in Richmond is District 5, which is in the south area. You mentioned the Panhandle Annex, Crescent Park was mentioned, of course, the Annex, and even Marina Bay and other areas in District 5. I mean, all of District 5 is very close to the South Shoreline and all the concerns about that, including the contaminated sites and how they can impact the health of our community. So I'm really, really grateful to you for doing such great work here and, you know, sharing it with your students and having them learn. And this is what we need. We need new generations to understand this. I know Councilmember Robinson just asked about other regulatory agencies, and I don't know if this is exactly what is an agency that would be making regulations, but I did get an email today, and maybe others did as well, from BCDC, and they're collecting data and doing outreach in terms of environmental justice for shoreline resiliency. So there might be some connections with them getting it and, strengthening some of their regulations. I hope so anyway. And I also wanted to mention, you touched on this in your presentation about how the economics of this is something we should consider, because, I remember always someone that I had a lot of respect for who has passed on. I used to always say the environment is the economy. And what he meant by that was that, if we don't care about the environment and do what's right, we're only going to have more money to put out there in the future to address the harm that has been done to the environment. And of course, the harm that is done to people is just, a huge beyond money type concern. It's just a human rights concern. But also some people may sue the city. So there's liability concerns if we don't address the environmental sea level rise that we know is coming. So I want to thank you very much for this. I do want to say, and I do see another hand up that the mayor will want to call on, but to end my comments, I want to ask the city manager if we could put Dr. Hill's presentation with her notes. I know she requested this, that we could put her presentation and her notes included, because what she expressed on the slides as we went through them was really important. So if we could put that perhaps on our website, maybe on the environmental page, we have a list of all the environmental things we're doing, including our climate action plan. So, okay, so thank you. Maybe Dr. Hill, you could send me this, because this is a different presentation with all your notes, so I could then pass it on to the city manager. So,
Yes.
Okay, so thank you again. Just really appreciate your hard work.
Thanks. I'd be happy to do that and provide it with the notes.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Jimenez.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hill, for coming again and with a much nicer chair this time to do your presentation and not get interrupted. So I really enjoyed your presentation. It's eye-opening to know, and is a tool for us to really, in the decision-making process that we are here in the city council, to know what we can do and what we should not be doing, or what we need to do differently. These scenarios that you have is like, sometimes it's like the horror scenarios, and sometimes I feel like, well, communities like Richmond and other communities will need a lot of resources to really start doing some of these changes and some of these planning. What are like the funding or grant sources that you can see that Richmond can seek for, that you see like in your research, you see like, well, states coming up with this new thing, so we can start thinking about how we go and seek for funding, because this will require money that unfortunately we don't have it here, but we want to see what opportunities are, and if you know about it, it would be great to know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that the city of Alameda has recently acquired FEMA grants and is applying for money from EPA. And that city has a fair amount of resources on their own, but because they're acting early, they're getting in line for federal monies, which I would recommend to any city, that you start early and start building relationships with these potential federal agency funders. And I know that the Strategic Growth Council has recently given an award to Richmond. I hope that's the beginning of grant awards that would help the city make plans.
Any particular kind of in the FEMA, or that you kind of like tell us with more detail?
I would highly recommend that folks talk to a woman named Danielle Mueller, who's the Sustainability Director for the City of Alameda, who's been quite successful in winning grants. And I know that she'll help.
Thank you. Are you finished, Councilmember Jimenez? Okay, Councilmember Cepeda.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Great presentation, very eye-opening, and I echo my other colleagues as well. I was going to ask about federal funding and partnering with the state as well, because this is not a Richmond issue. This has to be a partnership with California and with the feds. Also, immediately, I think we should start working with our transportation commissions and committees around the area, with TAC, et cetera, because with the sea level rising, Port Richmond, for example, in District 2 would be greatly affected because their egress is going to be Highway 580, which could potentially be underwater, which is, I believe it's like 1 or 3 inches of water rising. So that will be their way to get out. We had joked before about giving everyone a kayak, but it's not really funny when you actually have to exit in an emergency. So just want to put it out there. I think we should be working with the California, with the feds, and with our transportation agencies to help our residents being able to have a safe egress should any emergency happen and if the water continues to rise. So thank you for the presentation. Look forward to getting some more next time. Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank you for sharing your information with the City of Richmond. As you know, our environmental action plan is a living document, and the information that you've provided needs to become part of that document, and it needs to inform how we're going to move forward. Looking at the maps, I noticed that a lot of Richmond was mudflats and therefore landfill and subject to groundwater rise and possibly being subject to necessary canals or some sort of remediation in order to continue using the land. Looking at the maps, it seems to extend from North Richmond to Iron Triangle, through Atchison Village, Victory Village, Santa Fe, Coronado, all areas that needs to be redeveloped, but knowing that it's going to possibly be impacted by sea level rise, we need to start reimagining how we're going to redevelop those areas. Would you agree with my summation?
Yes, I would. And I think it's important to look for less expensive strategies also. And there may be ways to help keep the groundwater table manageable and lower without doing the canals, which could be expensive and disruptive to roadways. For example, cracked sewer pipes, not sanitary sewers, but storm sewers, might actually become an asset if we put pumps on the downhill end. So there may be some ways to use our problems as part of the solution. And I think Richmond could really pioneer and innovate some of that and be a leader for the region.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, any other questions? If not, then thank you so much. And we're looking forward to using the information that you've provided to make Richmond a safer, more attractive place for people to live. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to you all. I'm happy to work with anyone who would like some more information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.